People will tell you a forest belongs to whoever can cut the first log, but the truth is a lot quieter than that. It belongs to the person whose name is written where it actually matters. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't birdsong. It was the sharp whine of chainsaws rolling through my oak forest like they had every right to be there. By the time I reached the old gravel access road, the air already smelled of fresh-cut white oak, damp leaves, and diesel exhaust. 3 pickup trucks sat beneath trees my grandfather had protected for more than half a century, and behind them, a flatbed trailer was stacked shoulder-high, with split firewood waiting to leave my land. A woman in a crisp white jacket stood beside a folding table, smiling as families loaded neatly bundled firewood into their SUVs. A handmade sign read, "Willow Creek HOA Community Firewood Weekend. Residents only." Nobody looked nervous. Nobody whispered. They laughed, waved at neighbors, and thanked volunteers as if this had always been public property. Then I saw Patricia Whitmore. She stood with a clipboard tucked against one arm, like she owned every acre stretching beyond the tree line. Her perfume drifted across the cool October air, fighting a losing battle against the smell of fresh oak and gasoline. When she noticed me walking toward the table, her smile never changed. "Good morning," she said, almost cheerfully. "You're just in time. We've had wonderful participation this year." I glanced from the growing pile of logs to the fresh tire tracks carved into the damp soil. Every cut stump still glistened with pale wood beneath its bark. My boots crunched across acorns that had been falling here long before her subdivision existed. "This is private property," I said quietly. Patricia adjusted a folder full of papers without the slightest hint of concern. "Actually," she replied, tapping the top page with one perfectly manicured finger, "the HOA has established community firewood rights over this section of woodland. Residents are entitled to gather fallen timber and sustainable harvest materials." Sustainable harvest. I almost laughed. The oak lying in those trailers hadn't fallen on its own. Some of those trees had stood here for generations. A younger volunteer overheard us and confidently added, "The board approved everything. They said these woods belong to the neighborhood now." Around us, engines started, trailer hitches clinked, and another family drove away carrying a winter's worth of firewood that had come from my land. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and slowly photographed every truck, every license plate, every trailer, every fresh stump, every smiling volunteer, and the sign standing beside Patricia's table. She watched me with the kind of confidence only someone wearing borrowed authority could have. "You can take all the pictures you want," she said. "We've already checked with the county." I slipped my phone back into my pocket, looked once more across all 4,100 acres of rolling oak forest my family had spent 3 generations protecting, and simply nodded. "That's fine," I told her. "The county isn't where this ends. I'll see you in federal court. My name is Malcolm Brooks, and everything that matters in my life can be traced back to those woods. I am a 3rd-generation owner of 4,100 acres of oak forest in western Kentucky, and every trail, every creek, and every stone boundary marker carries a memory that money could never replace." My grandfather Elijah Brooks bought the first section of the property in 1958 after spending years working 2 jobs and saving every extra dollar he could find. Back then, nobody wanted rugged timberland that was miles away from the nearest highway. He saw something different. He saw healthy soil, towering white oaks, red oaks, black oaks, and a future that could outlive him. My father expanded the property 1 parcel at a time, always shaking hands with neighboring families before signing a contract because he believed a good reputation was worth more than another acre. When I inherited responsibility for the forest, I promised both of them that I would never sell it just because developers offered enough money to make headlines. Every season had its own rhythm. Spring smelled like damp earth and fresh leaves. Summer filled the air with cicadas and the distant hum of tractors from neighboring farms. Autumn covered the forest floor with crisp brown leaves that cracked beneath my boots, while squirrels rushed through the branches gathering acorns before winter arrived. Even in January, when frost painted every fence post silver, the woods never felt empty. They felt alive. We did not strip the land for quick profit. We managed it carefully under a sustainable forestry plan, harvesting only selected trees after professional inspections so the forest would remain healthier for the next generation than it had been for ours. Local furniture makers bought premium oak from us. Small sawmills relied on our timber. Families leased sections during deer season. School groups occasionally visited to learn about conservation. The forest paid its own way without ever losing its character. That was exactly how my grandfather wanted it. Every original survey, deed, tax record, and forestry management file was stored inside a fireproof safe in my office, alongside photographs showing each generation of my family standing beneath the same massive oak near the front entrance. That tree had become our unofficial family landmark. Its trunk measured nearly 20 feet around, and according to the forestry records, it had already been standing before the Civil War. Whenever life became complicated, I found myself parking beside that tree, leaning against its rough bark, and remembering something my father used to tell me. He would smile, place one weathered hand on the trunk, and say, "Trees teach patience because they never rush to prove who owns the ground beneath them." Standing there that afternoon, watching fresh tire tracks disappear deeper into my woods, I realized Patricia Whitmore had made the same mistake so many arrogant people make. She looked at thousands of acres of valuable timber and saw opportunity. I looked at the exact same forest and saw my family's name written into every season that had ever passed beneath those branches. Patricia Whitmore did not become president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association by accident. She built her reputation the same way ivy climbs an old brick wall, slowly, quietly, until people forgot what the wall looked like underneath. Before long, she was not simply enforcing neighborhood rules. She was rewriting expectations. She drove a pearl-white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly polished, parked in front of a house, with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds arranged with almost mathematical precision. Every Saturday morning, she walked the subdivision carrying a leather binder tucked beneath one arm, greeting neighbors with polished smiles while making mental notes about lawns, fences, and mailboxes. Most people described her as organized. Others called her dedicated. The few who had challenged her authority usually lowered their voices before saying her name. She had a remarkable talent for making personal opinions sound like official policy. If she wanted something changed, she rarely demanded it outright. Instead, she spoke about protecting property values, preserving community standards, and acting in everyone's best interest until people forgot to ask whether she actually had the authority to do any of it. Over the years, the subdivision kept growing. New homes replaced old pastureland. Cul-de-sacs appeared where tobacco fields once stretched across rolling hills. Families arrived from larger cities looking for quiet weekends, good schools, and picturesque scenery. One feature appeared in nearly every real estate advertisement: beautiful homes bordering thousands of acres of mature oak forest. My forest had become the backdrop for their dream neighborhood, even though not a single square foot belonged to the homeowners association. As more residents moved in, Patricia started describing the woods as part of the community's shared lifestyle. She never claimed ownership directly, at least not in the beginning. Instead, she organized guided nature walks along the property line, holiday photo events facing the tree line, and newsletters celebrating the forest as the neighborhood's greatest natural amenity. The language grew bolder every year. Community woodland, shared heritage, resident access. I noticed those phrases appearing more often, but since every event remained outside my boundary markers, I chose not to make an issue of it. Looking back, that silence became the opening she had been waiting for. Then came an unusually cold winter forecast. Local news stations warned about rising heating costs, and hardware stores sold out of bundled firewood within days. Suddenly, social media pages connected to the neighborhood began advertising affordable firewood available exclusively for Willow Creek residents. The photographs looked painfully familiar. Fresh white oak stacked on trailers. Split logs resting against trees I knew by heart. Patricia smiled in every picture as though she were leading a community service project instead of creating a business from resources she did not own. Neighbors thanked her online for providing such an incredible benefit. Some even praised the Homeowners Association for making use of what they assumed had always been community land. Not one of them questioned where the wood actually came from. Standing in my office that evening with the smell of oak still clinging to my jacket, I realized the greatest danger was never the chainsaws. It was how easily confidence, repetition, and official-looking paperwork had convinced decent people that someone else's property had quietly become theirs. The next week confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. This was never about neighbors gathering a few fallen branches for their fireplaces. It had become an organized operation, polished enough to look legitimate and confident enough that nobody stopped to question it. Every morning before sunrise, I parked my truck on a ridge overlooking the southern entrance to my forest. The cool air carried the earthy smell of damp leaves mixed with fresh sawdust drifting through the trees. I listened to pickup trucks rumble over the gravel road one after another, each one following the exact same route. Volunteers wearing bright safety vests unloaded portable signs that directed traffic deeper into the woods. Someone had even placed orange cones near one of my old logging paths to make it look like an officially managed access road. Patricia arrived shortly afterward with coffee in one hand and her leather binder in the other, greeting every driver as though she were welcoming guests to a county fair. She checked names against printed lists, collected envelopes, handed out colored windshield passes, and pointed families towards sections of timber she claimed were available for collection. I stayed out of sight and watched the entire process through a telephoto lens. Every receipt exchanged hands. Every vehicle entered. Every trailer left heavier than it arrived. The forest echoed with the rhythmic buzz of chainsaws, the steady thump of split logs landing on trailer beds, and cheerful conversations floating between trees that had stood quietly for generations. Nobody behaved like they were trespassing because someone had convinced them they were not. Later that afternoon, I drove to the edge of the subdivision and noticed new signs posted beside the clubhouse bulletin board. Winter Firewood Program, Resident Benefit Initiative, Sustainable Community Resource. The words sounded carefully chosen, almost reassuring, but none of them changed a simple fact. My property had never been transferred, leased, shared, or dedicated for public use. Curious, I requested a copy of the latest Homeowners Association newsletter from a resident I knew. Buried halfway through the pages was a smiling photograph of Patricia standing beside stacks of neatly split oak with a caption thanking the board for expanding resident firewood access. There was no mention of ownership, no survey, no deed, just carefully written language encouraging neighbors to enjoy one of the community's greatest natural resources. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. Community resource. I folded the newsletter and placed it inside a folder already filled with photographs from that morning. As the days passed, the operation only grew larger. Weekend reservations filled quickly. Families returned with friends. Pickup trucks from neighboring subdivisions quietly appeared in line despite the signs claiming the program was exclusive to residents. Somebody was making money beyond membership dues, and judging by the growing stacks of bundled firewood waiting near the entrance, the scale was far beyond casual gathering. Yet I still said nothing publicly. Instead, I documented every detail with the patience my father had taught me beneath the old oak tree. Dates, times, license plates, drone photographs, copies of newsletters, screenshots from neighborhood social media pages, receipts that residents proudly posted online after praising the Homeowners Association for such generous leadership. Patricia probably mistook my silence for surrender. She could not have been more wrong. Every confident smile, every printed permit, every trailer leaving my forest was quietly becoming another page in a case file that was growing heavier by the day. By the second weekend, the operation had become impossible to ignore. Cars lined both sides of the gravel road before the sun had fully climbed above the treetops, and the crisp morning air carried the constant rhythm of engines starting, trailer hitches locking into place, and chainsaws humming somewhere beyond the first ridge. The smell of freshly cut oak lingered long after each truck disappeared, mixing with wood smoke drifting from nearby farmhouses as though the entire valley had accepted this new routine. Patricia looked more confident than ever. She had upgraded the folding table to a branded canopy tent with the Homeowners Association logo printed across the top. Laminated signs directed traffic toward what they called designated collection zones, and volunteers handed out bright orange windshield placards that made the entire event resemble an officially sanctioned county program. Families smiled for photographs beside neatly stacked bundles of firewood, and those pictures appeared online within hours accompanied by comments praising the board for its outstanding leadership and commitment to the community. I read every post without replying. Instead, I saved screenshots, recorded timestamps, and quietly added each new piece of information to the growing folder in my office. Then I noticed something Patricia had not anticipated. A resident proudly uploaded a photograph of the receipt he had received after making a payment. He intended to thank the board for organizing such an affordable program, but the image revealed far more than he realized. The receipt listed permit fees, volunteer contributions, and a fund identified as the Woodland Improvement Initiative. I enlarged the photograph until every printed line became clear. They were not simply allowing residents to gather firewood. They were collecting money through a structured program built entirely around timber taken from land that had never belonged to them. Over the following days, similar photographs appeared from different families, each one revealing another receipt with sequential numbering. The numbers climbed steadily higher, suggesting this had been happening far longer than anyone outside the neighborhood understood. Every image became another document in my records. I also began reviewing archived newsletters from previous years that several longtime residents shared with me after I politely asked whether they had saved old copies. Buried inside them were subtle changes in language that suddenly made perfect sense. What had once been described as scenic views had gradually become shared woodland. Shared woodland eventually became resident access. Resident access quietly evolved into seasonal firewood collection. The transformation had taken years, moving one carefully chosen phrase at a time until almost nobody questioned it anymore. Patricia had not convinced people overnight. She had conditioned them through repetition, confidence, and paperwork that looked official enough to discourage curiosity. Standing inside my office one evening, I spread the newsletters, receipts, photographs, and printed social media posts across the large wooden table my father had built decades earlier. The room smelled faintly of old paper, cedar shelves, and fresh coffee, while outside the familiar wind moved through the oak canopy with the same calm rhythm it always had. The forest had not changed. The truth had not changed. Only the story being told about it had changed, and stories built on confidence alone have a way of collapsing the moment they meet carefully preserved facts. That was exactly why I still refused to interrupt Patricia's operation. Every additional permit sold, every smiling photograph posted, and every receipt proudly shared was quietly strengthening the case she believed would never exist. One rainy Tuesday evening, after another long day of watching trucks disappear into my forest, I unlocked the old fireproof safe that had stood in the corner of my office for as long as I could remember. The combination had never changed. My father believed some things should remain constant, especially when they protected a family's history. The heavy steel door opened with a familiar metallic click, releasing the faint smell of aged paper, leather folders, and cedar from documents that had been carefully preserved for decades. Inside were neatly labeled binders containing property deeds, tax records, professional surveys, timber management plans, and correspondence dating back to my grandfather's earliest land purchases. I spread everything across the large oak table beneath a warm desk lamp, while rain tapped steadily against the windows. At first, I simply intended to organize the evidence I had already collected, but buried beneath a stack of forestry reports, I found a weathered envelope with my father's handwriting across the front. It read, "Federal Records. Keep together." I had seen the envelope years earlier without appreciating its importance. This time I opened it carefully. Inside were certified survey maps prepared when portions of the property had been entered into a long-term conservation program, correspondence with federal forestry officials regarding sustainable timber management, and legal descriptions that matched every modern boundary survey down to the smallest measurement. Attached to one packet was a recorded easement agreement identifying protected access routes, timber responsibilities, and ownership rights that had never been transferred to any county, municipality, or private association. Every page carried official seals, recording information, and signatures that stretched back decades. I compared those documents against the recent Homeowners Association newsletters spread across the table. The contrast was almost unbelievable. Their claims relied on carefully worded assumptions and community language. My family's records relied on recorded facts supported by surveys, filings, and government documentation. As I continued reading, one paragraph immediately caught my attention. Certain disputes involving the recorded property interests connected to the conservation agreements could be addressed within the federal court system because of the legal framework governing those filings. I read the paragraph again, then a third time, making certain I understood every word exactly as written. Patricia had repeatedly insisted that the county recognized her position, and perhaps she genuinely believed that mattered. But these documents pointed toward something much larger than a disagreement over neighborhood rules. They revealed a legal foundation she had almost certainly never examined. I carefully scanned every page into my computer, created digital backups on encrypted drives, and placed the originals into protective sleeves before returning them to the safe. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the forest wrapped in a cool silence broken only by water dripping from thousands of oak leaves. I stepped onto the porch with a fresh cup of coffee and looked toward the dark outline of the trees. For weeks I had been collecting evidence of what Patricia was doing. Now, for the first time, I held the documents explaining exactly why everything she believed about those woods rested on ground that was never hers to claim. The case had quietly shifted from proving what had happened to proving who had always been right. The following Monday began long before sunrise. A heavy layer of fog drifted between the oak trees, softening every outline until the forest looked like it was keeping its own secrets. I drove 2 hours to Louisville carrying a weatherproof case that contained copies of every document I had assembled over the past several weeks. Inside were property deeds, certified boundary surveys, conservation agreements, forestry management records, drone photographs, time-stamped videos, social media screenshots, newsletters, payment receipts, and organized logs documenting every vehicle that had entered my property. Nothing inside that case relied on opinions. Every page existed to answer one question with evidence instead of emotion. The law office occupied the upper floor of a quiet brick building overlooking the courthouse square. My attorney, Rebecca Holloway, specialized in complex property disputes involving conservation land and recorded real estate interests. She listened without interrupting as I explained everything from the first chainsaw I heard to the homeowners association newsletters that slowly transformed private woodland into what they described as a community resource. When I finished, she spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents in complete silence, occasionally making notes beside specific exhibits. Finally, she closed the last folder, leaned back in her chair, and smiled in a way that immediately caught my attention. She did not smile because the situation was simple. She smiled because the paperwork told a remarkably consistent story. Every recorded deed matched every professional survey. Every conservation filing reinforced the ownership history. Every photograph connected directly to documented activity taking place inside clearly established property boundaries. Even the homeowners association newsletters helped explain how the misunderstanding had expanded over time. Rebecca explained that successful cases often depended less on dramatic moments than on disciplined preparation. Judges appreciated organized facts supported by reliable documentation. Emotional arguments faded quickly, but recorded evidence remained persuasive. Over the next several days, her legal team transformed my growing collection into an indexed case file with numbered exhibits, chronological timelines, enlarged aerial photographs, certified copies of official records, and detailed summaries explaining how each document connected to the next. They also retained an independent forestry consultant to estimate the value of the timber removed and compare the documented tree inventory against recent aerial imagery. Another specialist prepared maps illustrating every property line, conservation boundary, and access point using historical surveys alongside modern satellite data. Watching the file expand across the conference table reminded me of stacking firewood one careful piece at a time. Individually, each log served a purpose. Together, they formed something solid enough to last an entire winter. Before I left the office, Rebecca handed me a neatly organized binder containing copies of the exhibits we would rely upon moving forward. She looked directly at me and said, "From this point forward, let the documents do the talking." Those words stayed with me during the drive home. As the afternoon sun settled across the hills, I passed the entrance to Willow Creek once again. Vehicles continued entering the forest exactly as they had every weekend before. Patricia still stood beneath her branded canopy greeting residents with complete confidence. Nothing about her operation suggested she believed trouble was approaching. She waved cheerfully toward another arriving family, while volunteers directed traffic deeper into my woods. I simply kept driving without slowing down because for the first time since hearing those chainsaws, I no longer needed her to make another mistake. She had already made enough, and every single one had been carefully preserved inside a binder waiting for the right courtroom. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold breeze that carried the clean scent of fallen oak leaves through the city streets as I walked toward the federal courthouse carrying the same weatherproof case that had traveled with me for weeks. The building itself felt calm, almost detached from the emotions that had consumed so many weekends inside my forest. Marble floors reflected the early sunlight pouring through tall windows, and every footstep echoed with quiet purpose instead of urgency. Rebecca greeted me near the courtroom doors with a stack of neatly organized binders, each one labeled with exhibit numbers that matched the evidence we had assembled piece by piece. She did not talk about winning. She simply reminded me to answer every question honestly and let the record speak for itself. Across the hallway, Patricia Whitmore stood with several members of the Homeowners Association board. They appeared confident, chatting comfortably as though this hearing were simply another board meeting where they expected their interpretation to become official policy. Patricia still carried her familiar leather binder, and when our eyes briefly met, she offered the same composed smile I had seen beside the folding table in my forest weeks earlier. Inside the courtroom, everything moved with deliberate precision. The judge reviewed procedural matters before inviting both sides to present their positions. Patricia's attorney described the woodland as a long-accepted community resource, emphasizing neighborhood traditions, volunteer stewardship, and what he characterized as a reasonable understanding shared by residents over many years. Then Rebecca stood. Without raising her voice, she introduced the certified deeds establishing uninterrupted ownership across 3 generations. Enlarged boundary surveys appeared on display monitors beside aerial photographs showing the exact property lines. Drone images documented vehicles entering my land. Time-stamped photographs identified freshly cut stumps. Newsletters demonstrated how language gradually shifted from describing scenic views to suggesting shared access. Payment receipts established that money had been collected through an organized program connected to timber taken from property the Homeowners Association did not own. One exhibit flowed naturally into the next until the timeline became impossible to separate from the documents supporting it. The forestry consultant explained how individual trees documented in earlier inventories corresponded with recently harvested locations visible on aerial imagery. The surveyor confirmed that every collection area remained well inside recorded property boundaries. Finally, Rebecca presented the conservation records and federal filings preserved by my father decades earlier. Those documents established not only ownership, but the legal framework governing the property interests that had brought the matter before this court. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as each certified record confirmed the same conclusion from a different source. During questioning, Patricia acknowledged approving newsletters, resident permits, and organized collection weekends, explaining that she believed the association possessed the authority to manage what she viewed as community woodland. The judge asked a simple follow-up question. Could the Homeowners Association identify any recorded deed, easement, conveyance, or legally executed document transferring ownership or granting timber rights over my forest? Papers quietly shifted across counsel tables. Binders opened and closed. After several moments, the answer remained the same. None existed. I looked toward the gallery where enlarged photographs of my grandfather's survey maps rested beside modern satellite images. For the first time since hearing those chainsaws echo through the trees, I realized the outcome no longer depended on who sounded more confident. It depended on facts that had been patiently preserved long before anyone imagined those woods could ever become the subject of someone else's claim. The written decision arrived several weeks later in a thick envelope that rested on my kitchen table for nearly an hour before I opened it. Outside, a quiet November wind moved through the oak branches, carrying the familiar rustle that had always reminded me why my family fought so hard to protect this place. I unfolded the pages slowly, recognizing many of the exhibit numbers that had become part of my daily life over the previous months. The court concluded that the recorded deeds, certified surveys, conservation filings, and supporting documentation established uninterrupted ownership of the entire forest. The homeowners association had no recorded legal interest granting authority to harvest, manage, or authorize the removal of timber from my property. The decision permanently prohibited further organized entry onto the land for firewood collection, required appropriate financial remedies consistent with the court's findings, and recognized the documented ownership rights my family had preserved across 3 generations. I set the papers down and looked through the window toward the old oak standing near the entrance road. For the first time in weeks, there were no unfamiliar trucks parked beneath its branches. No temporary signs. No bright orange windshield passes. No volunteers directing traffic. Only leaves drifting across the gravel exactly as they had long before anyone imagined the forest belonged to a neighborhood association. News of the ruling spread quickly throughout the community. Residents who had honestly believed they were participating in an approved program began asking questions they should have asked from the beginning. Several reached out personally to apologize after learning the full history of the property. I accepted every sincere apology because most of them had simply trusted information presented as official. Trust, once misplaced, often teaches better lessons than anger ever could. The Homeowners Association quietly removed every reference to resident firewood access from its newsletters, website, and community bulletin boards. The canopy, the signs, and the permit forms disappeared almost overnight, leaving behind only empty spaces where certainty had once stood. Patricia Whitmore eventually stepped away from her leadership position. I never celebrated that decision because my goal had never been to embarrass anyone. I only wanted the truth recorded as carefully as my grandfather had recorded every acre he worked his entire life to protect. A few weeks later, I walked alone through the forest just after sunrise. The air carried the rich scent of damp leaves and clean earth after a light rain, while shafts of golden light slipped between towering branches that had witnessed generations come and go without saying a single word. I stopped beside the same enormous oak where my father used to rest one weathered hand against the bark before reminding me that trees never hurry to prove who owns the ground beneath them. He had been right all along. The forest never argued. The deeds never raised their voices. The survey markers never demanded attention. They simply waited for someone willing to read them with patience. As I stood there listening to the wind move gently through 4,100 acres of living history, I realized the greatest victory was never the courtroom itself. It was knowing that the next generation of my family would inherit the same quiet woods, the same enduring boundaries, and the same lesson that had carried us through every season. Justice is not loud. It is patient, it is prepared, and like an old oak, it stands long after borrowed authority has faded away.